Falcha, welcome back. We're on part 6 of our book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David Mcgowan. And we shall continue to chapter 14, The Great Serendipity, Buffalo, Springfield. And we begin with a quote. And as you see, we're making our way through the book. This is going to break your heart, but much of the music you heard in the 60s and early 70s was not recorded by the people you saw on the album covers. It was done by me and the musicians you see on these walls. Many of these kids didn't have the chops and were little more than garage bands. At concerts, people hear with their eyes. Teens cut groups slack in concerts, but not when they bought their records. This is a quote from Hal Blaine, longtime drummer for the Wrecking Crew, quoted in the Wall Street Journal on March 23rd, 2011. The Wrecking Crew being the session musicians, the studio musicians of Phil Spector. Stephen Stills and Richie Furay were in a folk group, and they went to Los Angeles to make folk rock music. In Toronto, Neil Young and Bruce Palmer were in the Mynah Birds with an AWOL Navy guy called Ricky James Matthews, who became Funkmeister, torturer, rapist Rick James. James Ambrose Johnson, who got arrested in 1965. Young had a quote-unquote hunch that Stephen Stills was in LA. He drove a hearse, Neil Young did, an old hearse. It wasn't in business. And they went to LA. They arrived in LA in April, on April Fool's Day, 1966. They had no luck driving around. LA is a big place. They had no idea where to look. They were driving around trying to find Stephen Stills, and they said, well, let's try San Francisco. And they're on their way to go out of town, and they were stuck in traffic. And they were spotted by Stephen Stills because of the Ontario license plates on the hearse. It was a 1953 Pontiac hearse. And he saw it, and I call this their meet cute. So this is worth reading. What transpired next is no longer considered simply a chance encounter, transcending mere fact. The events of the next few minutes have taken on mythical proportion to become in the annals of popular culture legendary. More than pure luck, coincidence, or serendipity, at that very moment the planets aligned, the stars crossed, everyone's karma turned positive, divine intervention interceded, the hand of fate revealed itself, whatever you subscribe to in order to explain the unexplained. Though each of the 5 participants in that moment in time tell it slightly differently, the fact remains that the occupants of the white man, individually or collectively, depending on who's retelling, noticed the black hearse with the foreign plate heading the other direction. Once the light of recognition came on, the van hastily pulled an illegal and likely difficult in rush hour U-turn, impossible, maneuvering its way through the line of northbound cars, horns honking frantically all the while to pull up behind the hearse. One of the passengers leaped out, ran up, and pounded on the driver's side window of the strange vehicle, yelling to the startled travelers inside who had taken no notice of the blaring car horn directly behind them. "Hey, Neil, it's me, Steve Stills. Pull over, man." The drivers of the 2 vehicles managed to find curb space or a vacant store parking lot, again depending on whose version is being related, and the 5 piled out to embrace and introduce one another. On April 6, 1966, in that late afternoon line of traffic, the course of popular music was altered forever. Anyone who actually lives and drives in LA likely knows that difficult is not really the word to describe the feasibility of making an impromptu U-turn in rush hour traffic on Sunset Strip. The correct word would be impossible, which is the same word that accurately describes the likelihood of that van maneuvering its way through the line of northbound cars, or of it finding curb space on Sunset Boulevard. Let's just play along and assume that Neil Young and Stephen Stills, each of whom for some reason had been dreaming about forming a band with the other, had a random chance encounter on Sunset Boulevard. In that brief moment in time, a band was formed, or at least 4/5 of a band. Coincidentally, they met up with Dewey Martin. He had drummed for the Everly Brothers, Charlie Rich, Roy Orbison, Patsy Cline, Carl Perkins. He actually was talented. He guest drummed, I guess is the word, and had just lost his job because the band that he was in decided to go some electronic, and they couldn't use his particular kinds of instruments. And so he had given all of his band's electric instruments were given to him because I guess they decided to go acoustic. And the name of the band was the Dillards, and that's right, they wanted to go back to their bluegrass roots, and left him high and dry, but they did give him the instruments. So lo and behold, from driving into Los Angeles and not having a clue, Neil Young had drummed up a drummer, all the instruments that he needed, and Stephen Stills and who was the other guy with him? He got them all together in the course of a day or two. And it was like a miracle. And they all had to learn to play these new electric instruments, and they had to learn to play together as a band. They hadn't grown up playing together. They had to write a repertoire. They were talented, that's the one thing. They played their first club date, April 11th, 1966, 5 days after they met. And 2 days after they had found a drummer and gotten instruments. So they had 2 days to rehearse before their first public performance. They played at the Troubadour, one of Hollywood's most prestigious venues that only the top bands get to play. They weren't barely a band. April 15th, they played 6 dates, opening for the Byrds, the hottest band around. They got a 6-week gig at the Whiskey A Go-Go. And on July 25th, 1 month later, they got an opening slot for the Rolling Stones at the Hollywood Bowl. I mean, come on. And the show was sponsored by KHJ, a radio station that was begun 1 year earlier, just in advance of the Byrds. And its first release helped to catapult the Byrds into Los Angeles, the zeitgeist, because they played them constantly. 3 days after the Stones concert, Buffalo Springfield released its first single, Nowadays Clancy Can't Even Sing, which was not that much of a hit. They signed with Atlantic, which was owned by the son of a Turkish diplomat who grew up in embassies and the intellectual elite. And he hired Phil Spector and had deep corporate ties to Washington, D.C. Columbia Records also was tied to Washington, D.C. money. They heavily promoted this new music. And this is from Peter Unterberger, Turn, 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 a 2-volume review of folk rock. And this is what he has to say about this kismet. As Unterberger duly noted in his expansive 2-volume review of the folk rock movement, much folk rock was recorded and issued by huge corporations and broadcast over radio and television stations owned for the most part by the same or similar pillars of the establishment. The corporate titans of all 3 branches of the mainstream media did their part to help out the titans of the record industry. Unterberger notes that AM radio and sometimes primetime network television would act as a primary conduit for this countercultural expression. Conservative corporate-controlled AM stations across the country almost immediately began giving serious airplay to the new sounds coming out of Southern California, and network television gave the rising stars unprecedented coverage and exposure. Primetime variety hours were much more likely to showcase rock acts than they would be in subsequent decades. New releases by the Byrds were often accompanied by large ads in trade magazines that simultaneously plugged the records and upcoming TV appearances. So they did a cross-media thing. The boys in Buffalo Springfield, for example, managed to find themselves appearing as guests on an impressive array of television shows, including American Bandstand, The Smother Brothers, Shebang, The Della Reese Show, The Go Show, The Andy Griffith Show, The Andy Williams Show, Hollywood Palace, Where the Action Is, Joey Bishop's Late Night Show, and a local program known as Boss City. They also made guest appearances, curiously enough, on primetime hits like The Mannix and The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. The print media did its part as well to raise awareness of the new music countercultural scene. September 65, the nation's premier news weeklies Time and Newsweek magazine ran virtually simultaneous stories on the folk rock craze, just months after the first folk rock release had climbed to the top of the charts. The country's biggest daily newspapers chimed in as well, providing an inordinate amount of coverage of the emerging scene. By the end of 1967, the movement had its very own publication, Rolling Stone. Initially designed to look as though it were a product of the underground press, it was without question very much a corporate mouthpiece. Another avenue of the print media provided the scene with considerable exposure as well. As Einerson notes, this is another writer, many of the Laurel Canyon stars, particularly members of Buffalo Springfield and the Monkees, were the darlings of the California teen magazines, including Teen Set, Teen Screen, and Tiger Beat. I remember Tiger Beat. Okay. Pillars of the establishment launched the counterculture movement. For corporate profit or something else. There was also a blind eye turned to the drug use amongst these people. Neil Young, Foray, Jim Messina, Eric Clapton, and a dozen of other music stars were arrested in a drug bust at Topanga Canyon home, and they were just let go. David Crosby said the DEA could have popped me for an interstate transport of drugs or dealing lots of times, and they never did. He was bragging. John Phillips was busted for trafficking pharmaceuticals, looking at 45 years and got 30 days. He served 24 days in minimum security. They were handled with kid gloves every time. The LAPD wouldn't even go into Laurel Canyon. They had a hands-off policy. They stayed out of the canyon. Most of them, these kids in these bands, were draft age, and they never were drafted. They pretended to be gay, they pretended to be crazy, they pretended to be unfit. They fooled draft boards, or so they thought. Were they being protected by corporate America? Real grassroots movement. The real grassroots cultural revolution would probably have involved a bunch of starving musicians barely scratching out a living playing in coffee shops in the hopes of maybe someday landing a record deal with some tiny independent label, and then just maybe, if they got really lucky, getting a little airplay on some obscure college radio stations. But that's not how the 60s folk rock revolution played out. Not by any stretch of the imagination. It does defy logic. So let's talk about Stephen Stills. I've seen it written Stills and Stills, and now I'm so confused, but you know who I mean. Born on January 3rd, 1945, he was Southern royalty, born in the antebellum South. Not really the antebellum South, but in that sort of an environment. He relocated to Illinois when the Union Army okay, sorry. He was born January 3rd, 1945. His family was Southern royalty to the antebellum South. Okay, I thought that was awfully odd. Anyway, his family relocated to Illinois when the Union Army laid waste to their lands in the South. His dad was a soldier of fortune. His modern father was a soldier of fortune. He was in military intelligence, an operative in Central America. Stephen went to military academy. He had a very authoritarian manner and a military bearing, and everybody in Laurel Canyon called him the Sarge. As a high school kid, he played guitar with Don Felder of the Eagles, also in Laurel Canyon. He was kicked out of the military academy, and in the next years, he did things that are murky. Nobody seems to know. He was in Central America. He even claimed he was in Vietnam. He didn't actually enlist in the military to anybody's knowledge. He wasn't drafted into Vietnam. So nobody, if you were in Vietnam, it was clandestine. He went to New Orleans, then he went to New York City. He joined Peter Torkelson from D.C. Peter left and went to Venezuela and then to Laurel Canyon and became Peter Tork of the Monkees. Nobody knows what he was doing in Venezuela. Stephen went to Los Angeles. Ricky Foray wrote a letter to his dad in El Salvador because he couldn't find Stephen in Los Angeles. Why was his dad in El Salvador? American experts were building an insurgency apparatus, police, National Guard, the military, communication and intelligence networks, which all eventually imposed widespread repression and war, and Stephen Still's father was into that. Neil Young was born in November of 45 in Toronto. His dad was in the Royal Canadian Navy. Chapter 15, Beyond Buffalo, Springfield, and the Monkees 2. And this apparently starts with a good quote. He was great. He was unreal. Really, really good. He had this kind of music that nobody else was doing. I thought he really had something crazy, something great. He was like a living poet. That's a quote from Neil Young about Charlie Manson. Many strange homes in Laurel Canyon were built, very early on at the beginning of the century. Some of them were built by celebrities, some of them were built by eccentrics, but there were many of them with secret passages and such. In this particular house where Stephen Stills lived, the house's most startling feature was a secret passageway behind a built-in bookshelf that he'd discovered during remodeling. It connected to a series of subterranean tunnels linking several houses on the hillside. While exploring the tunnel beneath his house, he found a makeshift grave. The headstone read, Regina, 1922. Yikes. Buffalo Springfield members all moved into Laurel Canyon. Richard Fury and Mark Volman from the Turtles lived on Lookout Mountain. Neil Young lived in Laurel Canyon. Stephen Stills and Peter Tork lived in Laurel Canyon. Bruce Palmer often was arrested and never prosecuted. He would go missing and would disappear for days on end, and they had to get substitutes to fill in for him. Doug Hastings often filled in for Young, who kept fighting with Sills and quitting. So he would just quit the band because he'd get in a snit, and then Doug Hastings would have to fill in. They'd have live performances, and he'd just take off. December 5th, 1966, the second single, For What It's Worth, was released. It's the quintessential 60s protest song, but it's not about war protests at all. It was written it is written about November 12th, 1966, the riot on Sunset Strip. And there was a riot, and it was young kids. 1,000 kids protested. They were not protesting the war. They weren't protesting any social government thing. They were protesting Los Angeles establishing a teenage curfew and announcing simultaneously that the Pandora's box, was closing. And, it was like the Whiskey A Go-Go. It was like one of those small venues, and they were just closing. And these kids rioted because they didn't like the curfew, and they were mad about the Pandora's box closing. It was one of the clubs. And this song was all about that. It had to close because it was built on a traffic island, and the crowds were so huge now that they blocked traffic on Sunset and Crescent Heights, the corner there, and it was a hazard. They thought it was ironic that it was written by Sills, who was a big authoritarian and a law and order guy, but he wrote this about people protesting a curfew law. It was not the most successful protest song. That was The Eve of Destruction. That was really the one that was legit. It was very dystopian, sort of. While For What It's Worth is now the best remembered protest song of the 60s, the most successful one at the time was Barry McGuire's recording of P.F. Sloan's The Eve of Destruction, which was also a curious choice for a protest song for reasons best explained by Paul Jones of the band Manfred Mann. Quote, I think that Barry McGuire must have been paid by the State Department. The Eve of Destruction protests about nothing. It's simply a Thy Doom at Hand song with no point. see here. There are big parallels and close ties to the Monkees, who had huge in-your-face sort of commercialism and were not really good musicians and didn't really play. And the Byrds were, that's kind of what was going on with them too. They just got really lucky and got popular. Jimi Hendrix, on July 2nd, 1967, opened at the Whiskey A Go-Go, and he moved in with Peter Tork and the Monkey. The Monkees were much cooler than they appeared to be on television, apparently. They joined the Monkees. He joined the Monkees on tour. Imagine Jimi Hendrix opening for the Monkees. Oh my God. And they had to drop him because he just didn't appeal to the Monkees fans. They had people like me going to see the Monkees, and people like my husband would be interested in Jimi Hendrix. There were enormous amounts of LSD. Our friend Augustus Owsley Stanley, with the Harry Potter name, kept supplying thousands of tabs of free LSD. Frank Zappa named his son after the Turkish diplomat who started Atlantic Records. Ahmet was his name. That's his second son. And he was Zappa's underworld manager, Herb Cohen, and he knew Stephen Stills from New York City. Many interconnections. Buffalo Springfield played all summer of '67 with Jimi Hendrix and the Monkees. They hit the road in November of '67 to open for the Beach Boys, and the the critic says, "Put them on stage and they stink." Their tour included West Point. Eventually, in '68, Dennis Wilson introduced Neil Young to Charlie Manson, and Young was smitten. You heard that quote at the beginning. May 5th, '68, at the Long Beach Arena was the last show they had as a band. They released their last album, number 3, and then they broke up. Foray and Messina joined with Greg Allman and formed Poco, and then Messina broke off and joined Loggins to be Loggins and Messina. And Randy Meisner broke off and joined somebody else whose name I probably wouldn't recognize to form the Eagles. Poco debuted at the Troubadour November of '68. The Flying Burrito Brothers were Graham Parsons and Chris Hillman. Crosby, Stills, and Nash lived at Joni Mitchell's house in Laurel Canyon and formed Frozen Noses, which was all about their cocaine addiction. Now, I had, of course I don't have it now because I'm such a good girl, I put it away immediately. I had an album cover of a Crosby, Stills, oh, here it is, Crosby, Stills, and Nash album, and if I'm not mistaken, yep, I'm going to show this to you. It's Joni Mitchell's artwork. So they had this band, the Frozen Noses, because they were doing heavily into cocaine. By 1969, the number 1 top album in the country was their album for 2 years. The tour was a problem because Stephen played all the instruments. I had nobody to play the instruments except him. So they brought in Neil Young so that they could have more than one instrument on stage at a time. They tried to have Bruce Palmer do the bass and sing, but he outsang Crosby and Nash, and their egos couldn't take it. David Crosby apparently was not a very good singer, always ended up having to do background harmonies because he couldn't carry the group, and he had an enlarged ego. The first Crosby, Stills, Nash album was about 95% of Stephen with backup singers, the guys. They dissolved after their 1970 tour. Okay, then Three Dog Night was mentored by Brian Wilson. It was psychedelic rock, something a little newer. Fronted by Vince Fournier, a rich kid from Phoenix, a staunch war supporter, and a golf partner of Barry Goldwater. He changed his name after Three Dog Night to Alice Cooper. And he decided that he was the reincarnation of a witch from the 17th century. Not kidding you, it's serious. Frank Zappa signed the band. Cooper and Brian Wilson both were treated by a guy called Eugene Landry, a psychologist, who controlled Wilson for a decade. We'll talk about that later. Gig Young was also a patient, and he and his wife ended up shot in the head. They'd been scheduled to be on a show that day. He was in a very good mood. They'd been married 3 weeks. They got along great. There's no known motive, and it was never solved. Sills and Young still perform. Foray founded today. Foray founded Cavalry. That's wrong. It's Calvary. Cavalry is a horse legion. Calvary is the religious hill where Jesus was. Calvary Chapel in Boulder, Colorado. I think the book got it wrong because I just copied this blindly. He was a pastor. Bruce Palmer had a heart attack and died in 2004. Dewey Martin died in 2009 in complete obscurity. Chapter 16, Altamont Pie, Graham Parsons. And we have a quote. No one could recall ever seeing or hearing about Graham being involved in a protest of any sort. This is based on Hickory Wind by Ben Fong Torres, who interviewed scores of people close to Graham Parsons. Never involved in a protest of any sort. Parsons had no significant level of success. He was considered hugely influential musically and almost entirely overlooked. So 1,000 years ago, Ferdinand the Great, the first king of Castile on the Iberian Peninsula, gave rise eventually to King Edward II of England and Eleanor of Castile. And eventually that led to Colonel George Reade, R-E-A-D-E, who was born in England and married in Yorktown, Pennsylvania. And eventually his offspring was, descendant, was Ingram Cecil Connor Jr., who was born in Columbia, Tennessee. He was a colonel in the military academy, and in May of 1940, he joined the U.S. Air Force as a second lieutenant. He was known as Coondog. He was in Hawaii, and he was a pilot. And then Pearl Harbor happened, but he wasn't there when Pearl Harbor happened because he didn't live on base, because he lived in a very luxurious mansion owned by Barbara Hutton, the heiress. She was the granddaughter of Frank Woolworth of Woolworth's Drugstores and the daughter of the founder of E.F. Hutton, who eventually ran afoul of the law for financial crimes. She was the niece of Marjorie Post Hutton, of the daughter of C.W. Post of General Foods, Post Toasties, that guy. Barbara discovered her mother dead by strychnine in 1917, and in 1930 she was presented at a debutante ball. Now this is the height of the Depression, with the Astors and the Rockefellers. The next year she inherited the equivalent in our money of $1 billion, and in the next year after that she was worth $2 to $2.5 billion. So she had numerous failed marriages. She had a boyfriend, Philip Van Rensselaer, who was related to David Crosby before Crosby was born. Ingram Cecil Connor was a major flying hero. This is Parsons' father. He stayed in the military after the war near Winter Haven, Florida. And in Winter Haven, they met the Sniveleys, who had come to the United States in the 1700s. They were Swiss Mennonites, and it was originally the name Schnebly. They came to Pennsylvania and had a daughter who married a son of an immigrant family called the Hirsches. And this pair, both families, Americanized their names to the Sniveleys and the Hersheys and gave rise to Milton Hershey, the chocolate guy. His first couple of attempts failed, but in 1900, he got caramels that were good and sold well. He used the money to buy 40,000 acres. He built the world's largest chocolate facility and a company town. The descendants of the Sniveleys owned a third of the citrus groves in Florida, and Graham Parson was the son of the Connor-Snively marriage. So Hershey chocolate, citrus fruit. Very, very, very wealthy. They had a huge house, lots of servants, and his parents were drinkers and swingers. At 11, he was sent to military prep school, and the next Christmas in 1958, his dad was found dead of a shot to the head. It was never solved. Awful lot of this going on. Graham's mother remarried almost immediately a guy by the last name of Parsons who sold heavy equipment to the Cubans and to dictators in South America. Snively's called him that greedy son of a bitch. He took control of her life. He adopted the kids and changed their birth certificates to put his name on it to get him tied into their money. He got his wife to sue her siblings, and he settled for a chunk of the citrus groves. They had a baby, and Parsons had an affair with the babysitter. He was involved with a group training in Florida to overthrow the Cuban government. He converted a downtown warehouse to a teen nightclub for Graham. Graham met Brandon DeWilde, the child actor, Richie Furry, and John Phillips while in New York with his high school band. He got into Harvard, not good grades. And at high school graduation, right before the ceremony, he was told his mother had died, but he went through the ceremony anyway, and his friends were horrified because they said you could not tell that there was anything going on. They say that his mom died of alcohol poisoning at the age of 42, but they also say that maybe, his father helped her along. And immediately after she died, the father married the babysitter. He was drafted. His father got him a deferment. He went to Harvard in September of 65. He dropped out in February of 66. Joan Baez, her dad, worked at MIT. He was connected to the CIA. He worked at Stanford, Berkeley, Cornell, and MIT, all with very active MK Ultra programs. He also spent a year in Baghdad teaching the same year that the CIA plotted a coup against Mossadegh, the democratically elected president. Oh, let's see here. Something to read you. Some of this stuff was just so convoluted. I could not find a way to reword it without losing my mind. Okay. In December of 66, 9 months after leaving Harvard for New York, Graham ventured out to California. Why there? He met a certain Nancy Ross, who at the time was living with David Crosby. In the book Hickory Wins, Ross provides some interesting biographical details. Quote, I grew up with David Crosby here in town. I was 13 when we met. David and I were part of the debutante set. My father was a captain in the Royal Air Force of England. I married Eleanor Roosevelt's grandson, Rex, at 16 or 17. I was still married to Rex when I met David. Was with David. The marriage lasted a couple of years. I got an apartment and started designing restaurants for Elmer Valentine, the mafia guy of Whiskey A Go-Go. At age 19, she went with Crosby up to his little bachelor apartment where I drew pentagrams on the wall. Soon after, Crosby bought a house on Beverly Glen and Ross moved in with him. That is where Graham Parsons found Nancy Ross and stole her away from David Crosby. Brandon DeWilde, who was a good friend of David's and Peter Fonda's, brought Graham up, this is her, to our Beverly Glen house one Christmas time. According to Nancy, Graham quickly stole her heart. Shortly after, in 67, Parsons permanently relocated to L.A. with his band in tow. According to the book Hickory Wind, Graham received up to $100,000 a year from his trust fund, a considerable amount of money in the mid-60s. He found a house for the rest of the band on Willow Glen Avenue off Laurel Canyon Boulevard and just north of Sunset. He and Nancy found an apartment together nearby. $100,000 a year for a kid. Wow. When his family home was empty, his stepfather's home was empty, it exploded and burned to the ground one night. So Graham joined the Byrds briefly, and he was very influential on their album Sweetheart of the Rodeo, but he left because of Crosby's ego. At 23, he hooked up with 16-year-old Gretchen Burrell and lived at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. In 1969, the Burrito Brothers opened for the Stones at Altamont. The Stones' road manager was an ex-con named Phil Kaufman, and he lived with Charlie Manson. After Brian Jones died, Jagger and Keith lived with Sills in Laurel Canyon. December 6th of 69, the Hells Angels security killed 4 and wounded 850 at the free Altamont concert at the Speedway. The Angels were hostile to hippies. It was a very weird choice of people to have as security. The Straight Satans, a group of bikers, tried to, tied to Manson through Danny DiCarlo, were in charge of Charlie Manson's arsenal and had ties to the Process Church. They keep coming up. Crosby had friends, including a Bay Area chapter of the Angels. He liked to hang out with them. He thought they gave him street cred. Meredith Hunter was stabbed in front of the stage as the band played the Process-inspired Sympathy for the Devil. The story is told wrong, but anyway. The Maisel brothers' film, Gimme Shelter, is not an accurate depiction. It was edited so that the chronology was changed. George Lucas was there filming as a cameraman, and he and Spielberg soon soared in films. Spielberg lived in Laurel Canyon on Lookout Mountain. The angel who killed Hunter, the guy at Altamont, was acquitted and later found drowned in a reservoir with $10,000 in his pocket. So we'll stop there, and next will be part 7. So this is the end of part 6, and with no more ceremony, launch.